The questions sometimes come up with, certain species of forage that are, most commonly grown in an area, like tall fescue and Bermudagrass. And as much as we talk about how resilient they are to a lot of the environmental issues around them, every plant has some kind of a threat. And so how do we manage to make them the most that they can be? In other words, is that related to grazing heights going into a certain period of the year? But how do we manage these particular species? Again, one being cool season, one being warm season. What are kind of those trigger points that we have to pay attention to so that we make sure that they leave one season and return healthy into the next? Does that make sense?
It does, and we may talk a little circular on some stuff, but on fescue, I visited with an old gentleman who'd been dealing with fescue for a really long time, and I loved his saying. He goes, "You want fescue to be taller than your ankle, but shorter than your knee. If you can keep it in that range, you're going to be doing well." And granted, the guy was about my height as well. I'm about 5 foot tall, so it's pretty short. But the fescue, as we'd already kind of mentioned, preventing it from going to seed or being able to slow its maturity pattern keeps your quality higher. And so applying your grazing pressure to keep it that 3 to 4 inches to maybe a foot at the most is when you manage your fescue to the highest degree. And that really becomes important when you're talking about rotational grazing with your fescue. The guys who get in trouble, and I'm going to go ahead and jump out and say this right now. Rotationally grazing fescue is the best way to be the most efficient with your management system. But when you have trouble is when you let the seed head get so far ahead of you. You don't rotate and put enough pressure and move through it fast enough to be able to maintain its appropriate maturity.
Jamie Lynn's friend figured out the essence of grazing management, where it took researchers in grasslands probably a century to figure it out with research. But the essence of grazing management is to try and trap a grass plant in a physiologically immature state. The immature state guarantees forage quality, guarantees a good bite of food for herbivorous animals. We don't want things to get too short, because if we are putting too much pressure on a plant, we'll get regression of root mass, and enough of that in a repeated cycle requires that the stand be replaced. That's expensive. We want to avoid that. By the same token, if the plant gets physically too large, it's got to reinforce itself. It's got to reinforce its physiology to grow physically taller. It does that with fibrous forms of carbohydrate that are less digestible to the herbivore. And this goes for any plant, not just tall fescue or Bermudagrass. If we can perpetually trap it in that immature state, as long as we have growing season, we can do as much as is possible to guarantee that good bite of food that we're all working toward.
And you'd ask about drought management, etc. Keeping some above ground mass is one of your best drought tools. But I will say we've even found this from the last several years at the research station here. I'd mentioned the different types of fescue. The toxic ones that have the endophyte that produce the toxins, the novel fescue that has the endophyte but does not produce toxins, or endophyte free. And we had found with repeated rounds of high drought or less rainfall, those endophyte free stands just really don't survive excessive drought near as much as that Kentucky 31. Could be twofold. I think one of the biggest ones is we do have cattle preference data and consumption, and the cattle physically eat less Kentucky 31 than they do of that endophyte free. So they may just be putting more grazing pressure on it. Because we have been dealing with some of the drought issues, I've received a lot of questions about when to replant and what to replant with. And if you go out and survey your pasture and you have more than 30% bare soil, that is a great, between 0 to 30% bare soil, you can go out and just rebroadcast or re-drill just in the bare areas. If you're over 40% bare soil, it's probably a more economical decision to just spray, smother, spray, and replant from the get-go.
In that case, would you have a recommendation of what species to go back to in one of those three categories, or which one of those to go back to if you had to go wholesale, start over?
So if you're having to replant, I really do think that the novel endophyte fescue varieties are going to be your best long-term bang for your buck. Okay. The improvements in reproduction rates, some of the data shows that you can get 4 to 5% greater pregnancy rates. You're going to see anywhere between 10 to 15% greater weaning weights with the novel fescue versus Kentucky 31 fescue. So if you've got the opportunity to replant, I do think those novel varieties are where you need to go. And make sure you understand the difference in novel from endophyte free. There's the endophyte free works great for haying, and if you're a really, really good manager and are willing to reduce head numbers on it, that endophyte free can last, but it just isn't quite as hardy. And when you're going from that toxic to that novel fescue, I said the word spray, smother, spray. That's kind of the best method. You spray it in the spring to kill it out, and then you smother it with some really high growth summer forage like sorghum sedan. That's one of my favorite ones to plant during there, because then you get a hay crop, so you at least have something to be able to feed your animals while that pasture's out of production. And then you plant in the fall your new novel variety.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is appropriate residual height for both tall fescue and Bermudagrass. As I've said, they're both really rugged, really grazing tolerant plants, but leaving a critical amount of above ground biomass, make sure that their photosynthetic factory is still functional during those times when animals are absent from the grazing system. So for tall fescue, for example, it's time to move, like Jamie Lynn said, about ankle high. We're talking about 3 to 5 inches of residual material. As you're waiting for that grass to regrow and you're waiting for the next biomass, or the next grazing bout rather, to come along, you'll want an accumulation of 6 to 8 inches of biomass before the cattle go back on it again. With Bermudagrass, we can actually graze it a little shorter. 2 to 4 inches of residual biomass is just fine for Bermuda. We would like it to be less than 8 to 10 inches tall when we get back on it. You know, it's fairly easy to determine both of those windows of time. A yardstick will clue you in pretty quickly on how tall that forage is and whether or not it's time to move. On the back side of things, when you're deciding when it's time to go on, maybe a yardstick is less useful because of variability in individual plant heights than just the visual appearance of the majority of the plants. Do they look like they are threatening to produce a seed head? Boy, you better get on them and get them grazed down again before you lose quality.
And one other thing I thought's been interesting, the last few years, through Kansas in particular, we have had fall armyworms that have just decimated brome fields down the east side of central to eastern side of Kansas like crazy. Very few fescue fields are impacted by fall armyworms. I won't say it won't happen, but it is interesting to see the reports that I have had. The endophyte-free fescue, armyworms will eat them, but if you've got a toxic one, they'll just kind of bypass it to head to the Bermuda, and they will demolish a Bermuda field as well. We have seen that too, but that's one of the pests that you know has been really emerging, that has been very detrimental to a lot of our tame grasses here.
Very good, very good.
And all grasses that are grown in monoculture, near monoculture, are susceptible to nature's silver bullets. We just need to be aware of what those things are, and when they do happen, how do we manage, or where can we go in an emergency to get forage for our livestock.